You would not have thought to invite him. A teenage boy, watching his father's sheep on a hillside outside Bethlehem, while his brothers stand in a lineup back at the house, assessed one by a prophet who has come to anoint the next king of Israel. The boy was not invited. Nobody thought to send for him. You have heard that boy called a man after God's own heart. That phrase almost certainly does not mean what you think it means. The giant he killed was probably not 10 feet tall. And the story you were told about the woman on the roof was missing the most important detail the grammar contains. In 1 Samuel, chapter 13, verse 14, the prophet Samuel speaks those words to King Saul, not as a description of someone in the room, as a contrast. God, Samuel says, has sought for himself a man after his own heart. That man has not appeared in the story yet. David is not named. He is not in the scene. At the moment those words are spoken, he is watching sheep in a field outside Bethlehem. P. Kyle McCarter Jr., who produced the standard scholarly commentary on the books of Samuel, argues the Hebrew phrase here parallels royal election language found in Babylonian and Assyrian records. When those texts describe a vassal as someone chosen according to the king's heart, they mean the king chose him. The phrase describes the act of choosing, not the quality of the person chosen. The label was never a moral grade. It was a statement about selection, spoken before David had done a single notable thing. Think about what that reframe means for a second. Most people carry this phrase as a tribute to David's devotion. The text places it as a statement about God's choice. Those two readings point in completely different directions. The same pattern shows up in the physical details. The Goliath story, the Bathsheba story, the years David spent working for the Philistines, all three carry details in the oldest sources that most people were never given. If the label was never about David's character, what exactly happened during the 15 years between that field outside Bethlehem and the throne? And who did David have to become to survive them? The giant Goliath, you were told he was nearly 10 feet tall. The oldest manuscripts we have give him a height of around 6 feet 9. That number grew over centuries of copying. The Bathsheba story, you were probably told it was a lapse, a moment of weakness. But a close reading of 2 Samuel chapter 11 assigns every active verb in the episode to David. He saw, he sent, he took. Bathsheba has no active verbs at all. And the parable Nathan delivers 3 chapters later identifies her not as a temptress, but as a stolen ewe lamb. The grammar and the parable say the same thing. What exactly happened during the 15 years between that hillside and the throne? And how did a man who worked for the enemy, arranged a soldier's death, and earned an explicit exception in the official record, keep the label anyway? David's rise from anointing to throne covers roughly 15 years. Most of those years he was not a celebrated hero. He was a fugitive. And for at least one of them, he was working for the enemy. His story begins in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Anointed in Bethlehem by Samuel, then brought into Saul's court as a musician. Then the encounter in the Elah Valley with the Philistine champion. Here's the detail most people carry about Goliath. 6 cubits and a span. That is the measurement in the Masoretic text, the medieval Hebrew manuscript tradition that forms the basis of most modern Bible translations. 6 cubits and a span works out to roughly 9 feet 9 inches. But the oldest witnesses to this passage give a different number. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragment known as 4Q Sam and the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, produced around 200 BCE, both read 4 cubits and a span. That is closer to 6 feet 9. Still formidable, still an imposing opponent, but not a mythological figure. Most textual historians who have studied these manuscripts prefer the shorter reading. The giant appears to have grown in the manuscript tradition over centuries. If you have been picturing a 10-foot monster, you have been working from a medieval manuscript. The older ones say something different. After the Elah Valley, Saul's jealousy turns lethal. What follows in chapters 19 through 26 is David's fugitive circuit. The cave of Adullam, where 400 men in debt and distress gather around him. Keilah, Ziph, and Gedi, where Saul enters a cave and David is hiding in its depths, and David cuts off a corner of Saul's road rather than killing him. Hachilah, where he does it again. These are the years the stained glass version skips, and then there is the year almost nobody discusses. 1 Samuel chapter 27. David, exhausted from running, crosses into Philistine territory and offers himself as a vassal to King Achish of Gath. He is given the town of Ziklag. For over a year, he raids towns while reporting to Achish that he is raiding Judah. He is deceiving his employer about his targets. He is excused from the Battle of Jezreel, not because he refuses to fight against Israel, but because the other Philistine commanders do not trust him. That year is in the text. Most curricula do not linger on it. Being anointed king while spending 15 years as a fugitive is like being handed the key to a house and then sleeping in your car outside because the current tenant will not leave. He builds a palace. For a moment, the story looks like the clean version. But here is the question archaeology spent much of the 20th century arguing over. How real was the kingdom David built? If David was largely a literary construction, that argument had stood for decades. So what did 3 broken pieces of basalt, pulled from a trench in northern Israel, do to the entire debate in 1993? For much of the 20th century, a vocal school of archaeologists argued that David was largely a literary construction. Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE, they pointed out, showed no evidence of a major administrative capital. The city was too small. A ruler as powerful as the Bible's David would have left more behind. The other camp pointed to architectural evidence that kept being revised earlier with new analysis, to the scale of destruction events that implied a real polity, and to the limits of what had actually been excavated. The scholarly debate was genuine and ongoing. Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE, based on what has been excavated so far, covered roughly 10 to 12 acres. That is smaller than many modern city blocks. Then, in 1993 and 1994, Avraham Biron's excavation team at Tel Dan in northern Israel turned up 3 fragments of dark basalt. Assembled, they formed part of a victory inscription in Aramaic script, most likely carved in the 9th century BCE by Hazael, the king of Damascus. The inscription refers to a defeated enemy's ruling dynasty, with characters scholars read as Beit WW, House of David. The first securely dated non-biblical reference to the Davidic dynasty ever discovered. That single fragment of broken basalt, found in pieces across 3 digging seasons, was the first archaeological confirmation that a dynasty traced to David existed and was politically significant within roughly a century of his lifetime. A foreign king, carving his victory into stone in the 9th century, was still identifying his enemy's ruling house by that name. Think about what that means for the debate. 3 fragments of stone, carved by an enemy, settled a century of scholarly argument about whether the name David had any grounding outside the Bible at all. What archaeology can now say? The dynasty was real. What archaeology cannot settle? The precise size of David's kingdom, the urban scale of Jerusalem in the 10th century, or whether specific events recorded in Samuel happened as described. The dynasty is confirmed. The details remain debated. There is also a fortified Iron Age site in the Ela Valley, Khirbet Kiafa, radiocarbon dated to roughly 1020 to 980 BCE. Its excavator reads it as a Judahite administrative city from David's period. Other specialists dispute the attribution. The site is real. The scholarly interpretation of it is not settled. The point is not that every detail in Samuel is archaeologically confirmed. It is that the dynasty was real enough that an enemy king carved its name into stone because it still meant something to the people fighting under it. A century after David died, that piece of basalt changed a century of debate about whether the name David had any historical grounding at all. It pointed towards something the text had been saying all along, that the dynasty was real and the name did not fade. If you are finding this account of David more complete than what you learned growing up, subscribe so you never miss a new explainer. We cover every person, place, and event in Scripture, completely and without an agenda. Which raises the next question. Archaeology confirms a dynasty. But the Bible records more than a dynasty. It records a specific divine promise made to David personally. A promise the prophets repeated for 6 centuries, and a promise the New Testament opens by citing. What exactly did God promise him? And why did it matter for 1,000 years? David has the throne and a cedar palace in Jerusalem. He tells his prophet Nathan he wants to build God a permanent house, a temple to replace the traveling tent that has housed the ark since the time of Moses. Nathan initially agrees. Then that same night, the message comes back reversed. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is the theological hinge of everything that follows in the Old Testament. God responds through Nathan with a complete reversal of what David proposed. Not David to God, you will build me a house, but God to David, I will build you one. The specific terms are remarkable. A dynasty that will continue. A throne established forever. a son who follows David, and a father-son relationship between God and that son. And then a phrase that separates this promise from every earlier covenant in the text. My steadfast love will not depart from him. The covenant with Moses was conditional. Obedience brings blessing. Disobedience brings consequences. The Davidic Covenant, as 2 Samuel chapter 7 presents it, is unconditional. Individual kings in David's line may be disciplined. The dynasty itself will not be removed. Think about what that structure means for what comes later. Because it means this promise has to survive everything David is about to do. The prophets carried this covenant forward for centuries. Isaiah, in chapter 9 verse 7, speaks of a reign on the throne of David that will have no end. Jeremiah, in chapter 23 verse 5, speaks of a righteous branch from David's line. Ezekiel, in chapter 37 verse 24, places a figure called my servant David as king over a restored Israel. Zechariah, in chapter 12 verse 7, centers the coming deliverance on the house of David. Then Matthew chapter 1 verse 1. The New Testament opens, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The first sentence of the New Testament is a direct citation of the covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The thread from a cedar palace in Jerusalem runs through 6 centuries of prophetic literature and arrives at the opening line of the Gospels. The most significant thing David left behind was not a city, not a military record, not the Psalms. It was a line. A thread that continued after him through every failure and every generation, pointed at a promise the text kept insisting had not expired. But here is the tension that promise creates. God has just secured David's dynasty in 2 Samuel chapter 7. 3 chapters later, David does something that should disqualify the man who carries it. How does the Bible handle the man whose line it just guaranteed, committing adultery and arranging a soldier's death? 2 Samuel chapter 11 opens with a sentence that functions as a verdict before the story begins. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants and all Israel. But David remained at Jerusalem. He stays home while his army fights. Look at what the passage does with its verbs. In the sequence covering chapter 11, verses 2 through 5, every active verb belongs to David. He arose, he walked, he saw, he sent, he inquired, he sent again, he took, he lay. Bathsheba, across those same verses, has one verb. She came. When David sends for her, she comes. The grammar is not neutral. The cover-up that follows is deliberate and layered. David recalls Uriah from the front, expecting him to go home to his wife and provide cover for the pregnancy. Uriah refuses twice, citing military honor. He will not sleep under his own roof, while his fellow soldiers are camped in open fields. David gets him drunk. He still refuses. Then David writes a letter to his commander Joab. Place Uriah at the front of the hardest fighting, then withdraw and leave him exposed. He sends that letter by Uriah's own hand. The man carries his own death warrant to the battlefield. The grammar of this chapter is not accidental. Biblical narrators chose their verbs with care. Then the prophet Nathan arrives, not with a direct accusation, with a story. A rich man with many flocks and herds, a poor man with one small ewe lamb, raised in his house, eating from his plate, sleeping at his feet. It was like a daughter to him. When a traveler arrives at the rich man's house, the rich man takes the poor man's lamb to feed his guest, rather than drawing from his own abundance. David hears the story and is furious. The man who did this deserves to die. Nathan says, "You are the man." He does not let the king sit with ambiguity. He walks into the palace with a story about a lamb, and when David's anger is hot enough, he delivers the verdict. The parable is not abstract. The ewe lamb is not a seductress. She is taken by someone with far more power and far more options. And then, in 1 Kings chapter 15 verse 5, the books of Kings offer their canonical summary of David's entire reign. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He did not turn aside from anything commanded of him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. The exception is explicit. The Bible built it into the official record. And the label is still there. The record is unflinching. The exception is preserved. But the most revealing moment in this entire account is not the failure. It is what happened in the 5 seconds after Nathan said, "You are the man." In 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul received the same confrontation from the same kind of prophet. So, why did one man keep the label for 3,000 years, and the other lose everything before the chapter ended? around 600 years after David died. A writer scholars call the chronicler retold his story. The result covers the same reign. It describes a noticeably different king. 1 Chronicles, chapters 10 through 29, runs parallel to 2 Samuel and the opening of 1 Kings. Same reign, same general arc. But something is missing. The Bathsheba episode, gone. Uriah's death, gone. Amnon's assault on his sister Tamar, in 2 Samuel chapter 13, gone. Absalom's revolt in chapters 15 through 18, gone. Adonijah's attempt to seize the throne in 1 Kings chapter 1, gone, not shortened, absent. What the chronicler emphasizes instead, David's organization of the Levitical priests, his arrangement of the temple singers and gatekeepers, his detailed specifications for a building he will not be allowed to construct himself. The chronicler's David is an architect of worship, a man consumed by the project he will never see finished. Why the difference? The chronicler's audience was a Jewish community in the Persian period, around 400 BCE, after the Babylonian exile. They were returning to a ruined city and rebuilding around the temple. The chronicler gave them the David who mattered most for that project. The editorial decision serves a specific audience with a specific need. Both accounts are in the same Bible. Neither cancels the other. If you have ever watched two people describe the same event and tell completely different stories, both accurate, both selective, you already understand exactly what is happening in this chapter. Two accounts, same king. One includes the worst thing he ever did. The other leaves it out entirely. That tension is not a mistake in the text. It is evidence of communities across centuries wrestling deliberately with the same complicated figure, choosing what to foreground and what to set aside. But both accounts still call him by the same name. Both still trace his dynasty toward the same promise. And both still leave the same question standing. What does it actually mean that the Bible keeps attaching that phrase to this man? After the record in Samuel, after the exception in Kings, after 600 years and two completely different accounts. Nathan has just said, "You are the man. The cover is gone, the verdict is delivered." In 1 Samuel chapter 15, there is a scene that functions as the mirror image of this one. Saul is confronted by Samuel after failing to carry out a direct command. And his response, across verses 20 through 25, moves through four stages. First, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. Second, the people took of the spoil. Third, I feared the people and listened to their voice. Fourth, please pardon my sin and return with me. Four moves: denial, redirection, explanation, a request for pardon that arrives before genuine acknowledgement. Then 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 13, Nathan says, "You are the man." And David answers, in English, 5 words, "I have sinned against the Lord." No explanation, no deflection, no negotiation with the verdict. If you have ever been the person who could not stop explaining, who had 4 justifications ready the moment someone raised a concern, David's story knows that impulse. Saul gave 4 justifications in sequence. David gave none. The difference between those two responses is the key to the label. Think about where the label first appeared. A hillside outside Bethlehem, a boy in a field before the prophet arrived, before Goliath, before the fugitive years, before Ziklag, before everything. The phrase was spoken before any of it, which means it was never designed to be a grade on what followed. It was the starting condition. The choice came first. What happened after was always taking place against the background of a selection already made. Through all of it, David kept one thing intact. He never turned to other gods. Solomon, in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 4, turned to other gods in his old age, and the evaluation of his reign shifts dramatically. Abiam did the same. David never did. In the framework the books of Kings use to evaluate every ruler across centuries, sole loyalty to one God is the foundational criterion. Not perfection, not a clean record, an undivided direction of worship. And when the worst moment came and Nathan said, "You are the man," David did not negotiate with the verdict. He did not explain. He stopped. 5 words. The relationship had started before he earned anything. He let it resume without argument. The difference between Saul and David when confronted is the difference between someone told their work is wrong, who immediately begins explaining why they were right, and someone who simply says, "I got that wrong." The first response might feel stronger. It sounds like someone defending themselves. But the second is what makes a working relationship possible across years of failure and recovery. Saul kept explaining. David stopped. That is what the thread looks like when you trace it all the way back. Attached to someone who never turned away from the one who spoke it. and who in the end did not argue when the full cost of what he had done was placed in front of him. The Psalms still carry his name. The New Testament opens with his bloodline. The last book of the Bible calls the figure at its center the root and offspring of David. And the label itself, spoken in a field outside Bethlehem, before he had done a single thing to deserve it, is still attached to his name, in the same breath as the record of everything he did to lose it. Millennium after millennium, the two things travel together. The label was spoken before David earned anything. It survived everything he did after. And what the Bible seems to be saying, across both accounts, across the prophets, across the genealogy in Matthew, is that the word after was never about what David deserved. It was about who was choosing. If you want to follow where that thread goes, the next place to look is the Davidic Covenant itself. What exactly God promised David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and why the prophets kept returning to it for 6 centuries. Subscribe for new Bible explainers every day. We cover every person, place, and event in Scripture, completely and without an agenda.